thank you so much for being with us for the last 2.5 days, and congratulations for surviving a marathon of discussions and debates, which I think have been truly enriching. The viewpoints, the perspectives, the diversity of speakers, and turning up in such large numbers on a Sunday when the weather outside is so lovely, surely it truly demonstrates a commitment to the most important issue that we confront, fixing the world ahead of us. And one of the most important players to get the world right in the future are going to be countries that have the largest stake in it. And those countries are commonly, or rather collectively, referred to as the Global South. They may not be similar. It's a very heterogeneous group. There are differences in political ideologies, in economic approaches, in their development pathways and situations. And we are going to try to talk to a very, very wise person who's been handling this matter for a very long time on this whole new phenomenon of the South that is rising, a South that is more visible, a South that is more vocal, a South that is more defiant, and a South in many ways that is now going to have the largest contribution in future growth of that we will witness in the coming decades. And to discuss what events external to this collective means for these countries, and to discuss the politics within this collective and what it does to reaching consensus on some issues, we will discuss, we have with us Ambassador Anil Sooklal, who is the Sherpa of BRICS for South Africa, someone who was responsible for a very successful BRICS summit. He under-promised and over-delivered. I remember meeting him at the BRICS Academic Forum. He was very modest and very careful in making big promises. But when you came out of the summit, you saw that the BRICS looked a very different group. And Ambassador Sooklal was perhaps the architect of this transformation that has taken place in 2023. But besides shaping the BRICS agenda and the BRICS outcome, it is fair to acknowledge that we are meeting in Cape Town also because of this man. We reached out to Ambassador Sooklal. We told him that it's important that we create a Southern dialogue out of South Africa, of the Global South. And he jumped on it. And he connected us to the Mbeki Foundation. He was, in some ways, he was the priest that blessed the marriage between ORF and the Mbeki Foundation, made sure that we were able to partner together and bring all of you here. So first, please join me in applauding him for his effort to make the Cape Town conversations possible. Now I've done the nice part. Now let me ask you some tough questions. So, Ambassador Sooklal, I want to ask you, first, the big grouse that the Global South has with the existing power structures. People complain that the existing power structures don't accommodate others. They are trying to contain the rise of others. They are trying to sometimes ensure that the cost of development or the cost of growth becomes more expensive. There are complaints we have with the existing system. Some would argue that there are countries within the Global South that have now adopted the same policy. What are we supposed to do? I mean, within the BRICS itself, for example, you would have, BRICS was created to challenge the hegemony of the North or of the West. There may be some hegemons within the BRICS itself. What are we supposed to be doing?
Well, firstly, thank you, Samir, for convening us here under the banner of Cape Town Conversations with the ORF and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Let me acknowledge President Mbeki, President Salif Johnson, and President Nasheed, and all of you. Look, I don't think BRICS is any different from any other grouping. It's not a homogeneous group. It's a highly heterogeneous group. But within the family, you have giants. Mm-hmm. And these are emerging giants. If you look at the pre-industrial world prior to 1810, India and China dominated the global economic space. We know the history of what happened to these countries, including the African continent and where we are. The global south didn't rise suddenly. It didn't come to the fore because Jim O'Neill coined this term BRIC. He coined the term BRIC, not BRICS. That has been there for quite some time. President Mbeki spoke of the Bandung Conference, and I think the Bandung Conference laid the template for South-South cooperation. The NAM, the G77 and China that followed, and naturally, we had to also get together, given that with the founding of the G7 in 1975, it became an elite group that addressed issues of concern to the global north, and the global south remained marginalized. With the end of the Cold War, we thought there would be an opportunity for the world to have a more equitable approach in terms of development. But what we saw, the further marginalization of the global south and the north still determining what is in the best interest for all of us. Now, of course, it was important for us from the global south to come together in some formation. And this evolved. Firstly, IPSA was formed in 2003, and eventually we formed BRICS. Now, within BRICS also, you have emerging powers. China has now emerged as the second largest global economy. India has just overtaken the UK as your fifth largest global economy. And by 2050, it's predicted that China, India, Brazil, and Russia will be amongst the top 10 global economies. Now, we are all jostling for space. Like you have the contestation for power within the global high table, those existing global hegemons don't want to make space for new entrants. We have to elbow our way to get a seat at the high table, and that is what we are doing through BRICS. You do have contestation within BRICS. I think that's natural. If you look at G7, it is also a highly heterogeneous group. Same if you look at the EU and other formations. But I think within BRICS over these past 15 years, we have found a mechanism to put the larger picture on the table as the major agenda and bracket our points of difference. Mm-hmm. And that has worked fairly well. We do not allow bilateral differences to dominate the BRICS agenda. And I think we have found a fairly good formula amongst the five of us. Of course, with the 6 new entrants, we'll also have to find a new mechanism of how we continue the cooperation without diverting our interest and our attention from the core values that BRICS want to champion in creating a more inclusive, equitable global order. And I think that you will continue to see rivalry within BRICS as you will continue to see rivalry between BRICS and other major powers. You would have seen earlier this year as we were preparing for the summit, perhaps this year BRICS received more global attention than ever before, and we were constantly being pitted as a counterforce to the G7. Mm-hmm. Of course, that is not what we are. But of course, the BRICS has become a powerful grouping, a powerful voice, not just the 5 countries. The mere fact that you saw 60+ countries assemble here in Johannesburg for the BRICS summit, that was also a very powerful message of the global south coming together. And I must say, my theory is the success of the BRICS summit laid the groundwork for the success of the G20. Because I think the world took note of what happened in South Africa and the powerful voice, not just of BRICS, but of BRICS Plus, in terms of also what Antonio Guterres said at the BRICS summit, that the world, the developed world, must do more to address the frustrations of the global south. Secondly, he said that the reality of 2023 is not reflected by the current global governance architecture of 1945. The current world reality is far different, and we need to address this. In fact, he used very, very strong terms that the Bretton Woods institution, the UNSC are outdated, irrelevant organizations today, and that's coming from the UN. So I think BRICS is on the right track. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be detracted, but at the same time, I think it's important what I call the way the North relates to the South in terms of the arrogance of power. I think it's very important that BRICS countries, as you grow in stature and as you have a more influential role in shaping the new global architecture, this arrogance of power doesn't settle into our mindset. And we start doing the same thing what the global north is doing to us with our fellow countries. In fact, President Hage Geingob asked these questions at the BRICS summit. Will you start behaving like the global north once you become powerful? And we said this is not what BRICS is about. And I think the important point is that within the working methodology of BRICS, we work on the basis of consensus, and I think we've been able to maintain consensus, and we work on the basis that all partners are equal. Even when we created the new development bank in 2016, China was very keen to pump far more capital into the bank, and we said no. We want each country
to have the same equity.
To have the same financial input in terms of the capital injection in founding this bank, because if one country puts in more, at some stage they're going to come and say they want more say and more influence. So I think we've been able to maintain this balance, and I think that's because we realize there's a larger picture that we have to address collectively. We can't do it no matter how powerful China is or India is or the African continent as a whole. We need to work in tandem with each other. We are not in competition with the global north. We want to work with the global north. And I think you've already seen overtures being made from countries from the global north wanting to have a dialogue. The other important point I made is that I'm glad that the G20 summit succeeded. Having been a former G20 Sherpa, the danger was we have paralyzed our multilateral institutions because of the global divide. The danger was that this organization, if that becomes paralyzed, I think we are in a dangerous space. So it was very important for this G20 summit in India to succeed, because the G20 can be an important bridge between the north and the south. You have the G7 members, and now with the addition of Argentina and Saudi Arabia, you'll have 7 developing countries in the G20, BRICS countries, with the African Union being there. There's a more equal weightage within the G20 to shape the G20 in the manner that we would like to see it move.
So, South Rising has an implication of institutions that the South is building, like the BRICS, and South Rising also means how South is shaping agendas of existing organizations, such as the G20. You avoided my question. How can BRICS demand reform of multilateralism when China and Russia don't want a reform of the UNSC?
Well, that's a point I made earlier on. If you look at the declaration of BRICS Summit over the past 15 years, we've had static language around UNSC reform. In fact, it was only at this summit that we had new language. And I think I was asked this question, do you think there'll be reform of the UNSC? And what are the impediments to reform? Some of our own partners are blocking reform. And that's, I think, a great challenge for us. Because we need to start amongst ourselves, and we need to agree amongst ourselves that when we speak of reform, it's reform across the board, not selective reform. And that's part of the challenge we have internally. And that's something that as South Africa, as Brazil and India, we have been challenging our 2 P5 partners that you need to come to the table and you need to open up space. And I think that pressure must be kept within BRICS as well as with the larger global community.
Ambassador Sooklal, there are a number of events in the last 3 years or 4 years that have made the global South more important for many of us. It has existed forever. It's only in the recent years that its salience has increased. So let me ask you a few questions on what certain events have done to countries in the South. Let's start with the Ukraine conflict. If you are sitting in Europe, it is about country A violating the territorial integrity of country B. Russia violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And it's a very simple equation which requires a very simple response. For people in the global South, what does this conflict really mean? So when you're sitting in Africa, what are the implications of this conflict for you? What are your concerns that decide how you vote at the UN or who you sanction or who you side with? What are the drivers of decision making here?
Well, I think if you look at the Ukraine crisis, and I think as BRICS, we issued a joint statement based on past declarations that we uphold the integrity and territorial sovereignty of all countries. That came out very clearly, with Russia being part of that statement that we issued. And of course, each of us had our national positions. But coming specifically to what it's done to the developing world, and especially Africa, you have the triple F, your fuel, fertilizer, and food shortage. That is why you had an African delegation going to meet with Zelensky and President Putin to speak about the impact this is having on the African continent. Because we are always, as the African continent, the hardest hit, whether it was during the pandemic, whether it's the Ukraine war. The implications is more for us than other parts of the world. And I think this is something we have to also address as a collective, that your foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, put it very nicely when he said when Europe has a problem, it makes it the world's problem. When we in the developing world has a problem, then it's our problem. And I think this is the disparate disjuncture that you're seeing in terms of how the world, especially the developed North, deals with these. And I think you're seeing the same. The billions of dollars being put into armaments and weapons in upholding Ukraine. And yet when you come to the situation in Gaza at the present time, or the plight of refugees in other parts of the world, some lives are more important than other lives. And I think this is what we are fighting against. There has to be uniformity of approach. And I think this has to be the central pillar of the Global South, working with BRICS and our partners in the Global South, that when we are speaking of creating a new international order, a new international architecture, that it must be underpinned by the core principles of equality, inclusiveness, and truly, when we speak of leaving no one behind, it mustn't be a catchphrase that we adopted in 2015 when we unveiled the SDGs, because we still leave the majority behind. And I'm saying this, that within BRICS, we also have to address this, because it's a challenge for us amongst ourselves as well.
So we've covered Ukraine, and you kind of also brought in the Hamas situation and the Gaza situation into your response. I'll come back to that a bit later if we have time, but let me ask you about the second development of this decade, the pandemic. And some would call access to vaccine becoming one of the drivers of how the South felt vulnerable, excluded, disenfranchised in many ways. What did that do to this continent? What did the experience during the pandemic, how did that experience shape your approach to internationalism, partnerships?
Well, I think what the pandemic provided us an opportunity, because the pandemic didn't care from which part of the world you were. It was a crisis for all of us. But the manner in which we responded, it was an opportunity for the global community to come together to preserve life, irrespective from which part of the world, what nationality, race, or whatever. But that didn't happen. All it did is expand the fault lines. And I think this is where the frustration of the Global South was seen, that we had to basically beg for access to vaccines, while countries like Canada had 5 shots per person.
And they were dumping it into the garbage cans.
Absolutely. So again, it's the value of life. Life of those living in the Global South, living in Africa, Latin America, is not that important. So we first take care of our own and forget the rest. And I think that's why countries of the Global South, India was a leader in that, in your Maitri vaccine campaign, where you started sharing vaccine with the Global South. And it also forced us to look at our own production capacities, our own research capacities, and become more independent and not dependent on the South, because it showed up our vulnerabilities very sharply. But I think that was a positive development. We came out of this pandemic much stronger, putting systems in place for Africa, for the Global South, and working with our partners in the Global South to address issues that impact on us and where the North see that they are doing us a favor. We don't need favors anymore. The South has risen, and we have realized that we can collaboratively work together and address our own needs without being given aid that has preconditions.
You mentioned that you have to jostle for room in the multilateral system, in global affairs. No one gives it to you as an endowment, and it is something that you have to work for. There is a line of thinking that suggests that the global south, while it has risen in stature, in economic relevance, in political stature, it is still lazy. It is still not propositional. It is still not building institutions, building frameworks, building solutions for key issues, including climate change, for example, or technology governance. Would you agree that we have perhaps focused more on reforms of existing structures, which are difficult, and less on building new structures that are more relevant to these times? NDB being a sole exception, the New Development Bank being a sole exception. Do you think it is time we invest more on putting new structures in place, new institutions in place?
Well, I think that's the direction we have to go. There's no appetite for reform. And when you look at reform, it's selective reform, again, that favors the global north. There's no real appetite to reform our multilateral institutions, to reform our global financial architecture. And that's why I think it's important for us to create our own institutions, to rewrite the rules of engagement. We were not party to that process, but we have this opportunity, and you are right, we have momentum at the present time. I think we are more together now than we have ever been as the global south. There's an opportunity. We spoke of the G20 presidencies of the three or four countries over the next few years. But it's how we take this moment and what we do with it that is important. We will constantly have differences amongst ourselves, but we have to act in concert for the better interest of all of our people and our countries. It's not going to be given to us by the global north. In fact, what we are seeing is more pulling back and guarding terrain, and that's not great. You know, I'm very often reminded of our own South African situation. When you had the apartheid government in power, they didn't want to give up power. They never gave it up voluntarily. So why would the current global hegemons just hand over power? They're not going to do it. We'll have to keep pressurizing, and we have to become leaders in this process of recrafting an international order where we are leading the process. And we have the capacity, we have the numbers, because, you know, the former foreign minister of Maldives, last year he delivered a lecture at the UN on the small island states. He made a very profound statement. He said, we are small, but we are not powerless. We are small and we are powerful. And this is what we are seeing about the global south. The global south of 1955 and the global south of today is vastly different. We must recognize that we have all of the ingredients to take the lead in reshaping this global architecture. And we must do that in concert. You can't do it with the entire global south. As Minister Pandwa also mentioned yesterday, within Africa, Africa started rising as a result of President Mbeki, Bouteflika, and Obasanjo going to the G8 at the Okinawa summit in 2000 and speaking of Africa's development. That's how NEPAD was birthed. But of course, President Mbeki has better knowledge of that because he was at the forefront of that. I'm saying that BRICS is a catalyst. BRICS is a catalyst that has brought us together, and now you have BRICS Plus. We are a far more powerful grouping. Plus you have this associate relationship with the larger global south.
So, you know, Ambassador Sooklal, the two of us on this stage are folks who have engaged with BRICS since 2008, 2009. So we have grown old watching BRICS take off. Now here is a question to you. You mentioned recrafting the international order. Do you think with the addition of these new members, and I'm now referring to a question in the previous panel, do you think with the addition of these members, it is time to think of building a IEA or an energy research center that looks at the needs, pricing, price points, accessibility and affordability of energy for the global south? Is it time to focus on building an energy institution for the future with the largest producers and consumers within the group itself? Is it time to think of recasting how energy is treated, and new energy as well, by the way, the green transitions, the biofuels? You look at the energy and it's available within this group. So is it time? So that's one question. The second, of course, commodities, food commodities, minerals, deposits. Is it time now to build the new NDBs in different sectors, to create the energy centers, to create the commodity centers, to create the food alliance, maybe the food for all alliance that ensures that no one dies of starvation when there is grain rotting in godowns in different parts of the world?
Well, I think it's important we start creating our own institutions. The NDB is an example that it can work. I recall when we took the decision in 2013 in Durban to create our own MDB, there was a great deal of skepticism, including, especially from the North, that this structure will not work. We have shown that it worked. You saw during the pandemic, we had opportunity to go to the NDB to seek assistance in addressing the challenges of the pandemic and the post-pandemic economic recovery, where all of us benefited from that. But I think we need to create our own institutions. And within BRICS, we have the BRICS Energy Research Platform. That is quite active. In fact, they will now at COP28 next week release the Justice Transition Report of BRICS at COP28. So you have an architecture already in existence. With the addition of the new members, BRICS countries will be responsible for 45% of global oil reserves. Now that's vast. It gives us greater muscle in terms of the energy sector, at the same time also addressing the issue of just transition and green energy. So we already have the BRICS ministerial track on energy, and you have the research platform. So I think we need to build on that and look at creating more of our own institutions and structures that cater to our needs, and not be totally dependent on structures that have been created for a specific group of countries.
And what about food security and food for all?
Well, the point was made earlier on of Africa and the potential of Africa as 60% of arable land. And I think we need to harness the potential of Africa in partnership with our BRICS friends. And that is why whenever BRICS took place in Africa, when we were in the chair, as South Africa, we always included the African agenda. And that was very, very much a sharp focus of the 15 BRICS Summit. And I think there is an appreciation for the partnership. But what we also said to our BRICS partners, because all of them, from China with FOCAC, from India with IAFS, Brazil and the Latin America Africa Forum, Russia Africa Forum, that do not use Africa as a competition ground. Work with us in tandem, because there's enough space for all of us to collectively address Africa's developmental challenges. We have the blueprint there, the NEPAD. We also have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that came into sharp focus during discussion with our BRICS partners and African leaders during the summit. So we have to create space to address our own challenges and find solutions by ourselves, and not think that solutions will come from outside.
So before we conclude this fascinating conversation, let me ask you something that I have tried to ask a few other wise people around the world. I asked my foreign minister, you mentioned Dr. Jaishankar, I asked my foreign minister, what is Global South? How do you define Global South? I think his response was, if you are Global South, you know it. That was his reply. Let me ask you that. In your mind, what is Global South?
Let me, I was in Berlin for a roundtable a few years back. And during the interactive session, a gentleman got up and asked me, why did you have to go and create BRICS? I told him, you tell me why you created G7, then I'll answer that. Now, we are constantly, since Friday, I've heard this come up several times, and this year I've participated in many, many conferences where I'm asked about this, what is Global South? Why don't we ask, what is Global North? We take it for granted that we all understand what Global North is. But yet we constantly want to interrogate
to define the South.
To define the South. And I think that's a distraction we shouldn't get involved in. I think Dr. Jaishankar is correct. We all know what we speak of when we speak of the Global South. Let us not take our eye off the ball and remain focused and work together in tandem in order to create the architecture we want and lead that process.
So if you are South, you know it. Okay. Final question. Since you are the co-architect of this effort that the MBK Foundation and ORF have put together, your reflections on the last 2 days, let me just tell all of you here in this room, only two gentlemen have watched every session of this conference, President MBK himself and Ambassador Sooklal. So let me ask Ambassador Sooklal, how, as we close this day, and we'll just come to the valedictory address by the President himself, but as we close, your reflections on this conference and your expectations for next year, your ambitions for next year.
Well, Samir, I think you're giving me too much credit. I couldn't stay away from any session. I would be in trouble with President Mbeki. So therefore I had to be here. But that aside, let me firstly say, whenever I attended Raisina, and Raisina is such, I've seen Raisina grow and become such an important platform. And you have many other such platforms in Asia, in Latin America, and in Europe. What troubled me is that we didn't have such a platform in Africa, where we can meet in Africa, bring global friends and experts and voices together with African leaders and reflect not just on the challenges for Africa, but the challenges of the global South and the challenges of the international community as a whole. And I think this is what Cape Town Conversation is. And I want to thank you and President Mbeki for giving us this opportunity to have our own structure and our own platform to address the critical geopolitical, geoeconomic, and financial issues that impacts on all of us. And I think we've had such rich discussions since Friday. And I was saying to colleagues, next year you're going to have a problem because you'll have double the number of people wanting to come to this platform because of the vibrancy in it, and it's not a talk shop. Because as you have stated, you're going to have a policy brief coming out of this that will be fed into the G20 of Brazil's presidency. When we meet next year, it will be on the eve of us taking over the presidency of the G20, and I think it will be a timely intervention. So thank you for this platform.
So ladies and gentlemen, like I promised you, one of the wisest and most thoughtful practitioners, someone whom I've learned from a lot over the years. Thank you so much for your partnership, for your leadership, and for helping us put this together. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Sooklal.